Welcome to episode 35 of the Lucretius Today podcast. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Now let's join the discussion with Charles reading today's text.
Besides, a blow falling upon any animal, heavier than its nature can endure, immediately torments it and confounds all its senses, both of body and mind, for the connection of the seeds is dissolved, and the vital motions are wholly obstructed, till the force of the blow, being agitated violently through the limbs, dissolves the vital ties of the souls from the body, and compels her, scattered and broken to pieces, to fly out through every pore. For what can we conceive to be the effect of such a stroke but to separate and dissolve the seeds that were united before? And then it happens, when the blow falls with less violence, that the remains of vital motion often get better. They recover and calm the great disorders of the blow, and recall everything again into its proper channel. They rescue the body, as it were, from the jaws of death, and give new life to the senses that were almost destroyed. Else why should creatures rather return to life from the very gates of death with new spirits, than when they were just entering in, proceed on and utterly perish? Further, since we feel pain when the seeds are shaken from their natural state and situation within, and are disordered through all the bowels and limbs by any outward force, and when they return again into their proper place, a quiet pleasure immediately succeeds. You may conclude that simple seeds cannot be tormented with pain, nor of themselves be affected with pleasure, because they do not consist of principles or other seeds by whose violent motions they may be disturbed, or be delighted with any pleasure they can give, and therefore they cannot possibly be endured with any sense at all. Again, if in order to produce creatures of sense must be imputed to the seeds from which they are formed, of what principles, I pray, is the human race properly composed? Of such, no doubt, as laugh and shake their little sides, such as bedew their face and cheeks with flowing tears, such as can widely talk how things are mixed, and such as search of what first principles themselves are formed. For all things that enjoy the faculties of perfect animals must consist of other seeds like them, and these must arise from others, and thus the progression would be infinite. I urge further, whatever you observe to speak, to laugh, to be wise, must proceed from other seeds that can perform the same. But if this be ridiculous and downright madness, and things that can laugh can spring from seeds that never smile, and the wise that learnedly dispute are produced from foolish seeds and stupid, what hinders that sensible things may not as well be formed from seeds without any matter of sense at all?
Thank you, Charles, and I'll read the rest of the passage for today. Lastly, we all spring from ethereal seed. We have all one common parent. When the kind earth, our mother, receives the quickening drops of moisture from above, she conceives us and brings forth shining fruits and pleasant trees, the human race, and all the race of beasts. She yields them proper food on which they feed, and lead a pleasant life, and propagate their kind, and therefore has she justly gained the name of mother. The parts that first from earth arose return to earth again. What descended from the sky, those parts brought back again that heavens receive. Nor does death so put an end to beings as to destroy the very seeds of them, but only disunites them, then makes new combinations, and is the cause that all things vary their forms and change their colors, become sensible, and in a moment lose all their sense again. You may know from hence of what importance it is with what the first seeds of things are united, and in what position they are contained, and what are the several motions they give and take among themselves. And from hence you may conclude that these first seeds are not the less eternal because you perceive them floating, as it were, upon the surface of bodies, and subject to be born and die. It is of like concern with what the several letters are joined in these verses of mine, and in what order each of them is disposed. For the same letters make up the words to signify the heaven, the sea, the earth, the rivers, the sun. The same express the fruits, the trees, the creatures. If they are not all, yet by much the greater part are alike, but they differ in their situation. So likewise in bodies, when the intervals of the seeds, their courses, connections, weights, strokes, union, motions, order, position, figure, when these things are changed, the things themselves must be changed likewise. Now apply your mind to the documents of true reason, for a new scheme of philosophy presses earnestly for your attention. A new scene of things displays itself before you. Yet there is nothing so obvious but may at first view seem difficult to be believed, and there is nothing so prodigious and wonderful at first that men do not by degrees cease to admire. For see the bright and pure color of the sky, possessed on every side by wandering stars, and the moon's splendor, and the sun's glorious light. These, if they now first shone to mortal eyes, and subtly presented to our view, what could more wonderful appear than these? And what before could men less presume to expect? Nothing surely so surprising would the sight have been. But now, quite tired and cloyed with the prospect, none of us vouches so much as to cast our eyes up towards the bright temples of the sky. Therefore do not be frightened and conceive an aversion to an opinion because of its novelty, but search it rather with a more piercing judgment. If it appears to you to be true, embrace it. If false, set yourself against it. Okay, that's the end of the text that we were going to discuss today, and we need to go back to the very beginning, but I have to comment at the end there is something that Martin and I were just discussing before we began recording today about how Epicurean philosophy and Epicurus himself would take what people call dogmatic positions. That Epicurus took the position that knowledge is possible and certain things can be known, and if you know something, then you're going to take a position with confidence that that thing is true. But even though Epicurus was what they call a, quote, dogmatic, unquote, philosopher, he insisted that you question the things that come before you, and you should not allow yourself to be averted from an opinion because it's new to you or because it's not your current opinion, but you have to search it, and with piercing judgment, it says here. And if it appears true to you, then you embrace it. But if false, you set yourself against it. So you're just never going to accept somebody's word for something without challenging it if you don't think it's correct. All right, and that's a tangent from the end of the text, but we need to go back to the beginning and start from there. So at the beginning, we're back to discussing the fact that blows and motion seem to affect sensation and affect thought.
Yeah, I was also looking at how he figured that cells regenerated.
So we're talking in that first paragraph about cells being disrupted or seeds being disrupted, and then how they may in certain instances come together again. And that last sentence in particular is sort of a question. Else why should creatures rather return to life from the very gates of death with new spirits than when they were just entering in, proceed on, and utterly perish? Maybe that would be easier to read in another translation.
Mm-hmm.
Monroe uses, in that sentence, Monroe says, for in what other way should the thing be able to gather together its powers of mind and come back to life from the very threshold of death, rather than pass on to the goal to which it had almost run and so pass away? And Bailey says, for what other means could living things gather their wits and turn back to life, even from the very threshold of death, rather than pass on, whither their race is almost run and pass away? So what's the point of that whole passage? That a conscious living thing can be shaken up by an outside motion and almost die, but heal itself or come back from the gates of death by the pieces coming back into their proper places. Presumably what he's doing with that argument is saying that that's an indication that the pieces themselves are not conscious or sensible.
They're just a function.
That the sensing or the consciousness is a function of inanimate atoms.
So it would be further, since we feel pain when the seeds are shaken. and relating it back to pleasure and pain.
How the returning of the seeds to their proper place is followed by a quiet pleasure.
And that's something we've talked about before. I can't name any threads off the top of my head, but I know it's been talked about before how there's whenever like a pain ends, there's that sense of relief can be considered pleasure.
Right. And then there is the term of smooth motion that's associated with Epicurus in certain passages. I'm not even sure where those would be either, but this would presumably be an example of smooth motion being pleasurable while disordered motion painful.
Ooh, I'm trying to remember where that's from.
I believe there's a passage in which Epicurus, the passage in which he says that he would not know the good except for the pleasures of music, and I think smooth motion is within that passage.
Well, maybe he starts out another quote similarly, but the one I'm thinking of that starts with, I know not how I can conceive of the good. It's from Diogenes Laertius. It was in the treatise on the end of life he wrote. I know not how I can conceive of the good if I withdraw the pleasures of taste and withdraw the pleasures of love and those of hearing and sight.
Well, a quick Google on Epicurus and smooth motion returns.
Maybe it's from a different translation.
From Athenaeus, the Deep No Sophists, there's a repeat of that Diogenes Laertius quote. Alternate translation says, as for myself, I cannot conceive of the good if we exclude the pleasures derived from taste, or those derived from sexual intercourse, or those derived from entertainments to which we listen, or those derived from the motions of a figure delightful to the eye.
Yeah, that's close. It doesn't have the word smooth in it, but yes.
No.
Well, okay. Another looking up I use the atlas.org list of quotes.
Yeah, I'm on Epicurea right now, or Eusner's.
Yeah. Eusner 4:11, Charles. Plutarch against Colotus 27. No teacher is needed. By themselves, these glorious, smooth, and agreeable movements of the flesh, as they themselves assert, call to action even one who stoutly denies and refuses to acknowledge that he unbends and turns soft in response to them. That's kind of weird, but that's a use of smooth motion there.
Did you say U411?
U411, yes. And then U604. Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, volume 26, talks about that nothing interests us except the bodily sensation of either rough or smooth. So there's smooth there. And perhaps there's other texts that are more clear on that. Okay, well, the next paragraph, the last one that you read, Charles, makes the same point. In a very clear way, he's rejecting the idea that people are made of little people seeds.
Mm-hmm.
He's making the point that the seeds themselves cannot talk about how things are mixed together. They can't laugh or shake their sides or bedew their face and cheeks with tears, and that they don't ask questions about themselves. The seeds themselves do not debate their nature like we debate our nature. Now, maybe one of his more clear logical arguments there is at the end of that, what we have is the third paragraph where he says, I urge further that whatever you observe to be wise, it would be not logical to say that wise people must arise from wise seeds, because we see that people can be both wise and unwise at the same time, so that there's no such thing as a wise seed and a foolish seed. And if therefore a seed can be either foolish or wise, because we see people can be both, then the last sentence of that says, what hinders that sensible things may not be formed from seeds that have no sense at all? If you want to maintain that the seeds are foolish or wise, then why don't you just maintain that the seeds have no wisdom at all? Martin, thoughts so far?
No.
It reminds me a bit of Anaxagoras' homeomery, which I guess a lot of Epicurean physics takes some inspiration from. The third paragraph.
Or rejects Anaxagoras' homeomery, right?
Both.
Because that's what this is. The argument that seeds can be little people, that's homeomery, right, Charles?
Yes, it is. that were comprised of little people seeds because of people.
And corn is comprised of little corn seeds, and trees are composed of little tree seeds or whatever. The seeds are miniature versions of the final thing.
And because we are people, we would our constitution would be primarily those people seeds. We would have a little bit of, I don't know, animal or other animals, and then gold and whatever. But I mean, Lucretius addressed this pretty early on.
When you said that a few minutes ago about it being in Book 1, I could not remember. But now that you bring up Anaxagoras, you're exactly right. That's one of the first things that they kind of attacked in talking about how Anaxagoras had been wrong, I think, in suggesting that. So, yes, that was in Book 1.
Yes, because this is the second time he's used the analogy of the seeds laughing, or bedewing their faces with tears and laughter. Though in the context then, it was about laughing at other philosophers' ideas.
And here he's just laughing at the idea in general.
Mm-hmm.
Or you maybe twisting it or turning it in a little bit different direction, saying that even if you think people are made of little seeds, obviously people must be made of different kinds of little seeds, because some people are wise and some people are foolish. Well, if they can be wise seeds and foolish seeds, why can't there just be seeds that have no sense at all? And then I guess at the end of that passage that you just talked about is where he basically reaches what he is asserting to be the correct conclusion, that rather than being wise or foolish or whatever, what is important is how the seeds are joined together and how they are, what order and what motions and what connections and so forth they have. That's what determines the result, and not just the seeds have some special nature among themselves. And he uses the example, I think this was also in Book 1, I'm not sure, about how the same letters make up the words that describe the stars, the sky, the earth, the sea, the rivers, the sun. And those are very different things, but the same letters are used to describe them. So the issue is that's what you do. You combine the letters in different ways, and you combine the seeds in different ways.
Well, the letters, I believe, was our analogy, but towards the end of Book 1, I remember Lucretius was saying that you could take his words but change the verse, and it'll be the same, because it was about the combination. I think we use letters as the example.
I guess they both work. That would be maybe an analogy between atoms and molecules or whatever, is that the letters are maybe the primary thing, but you can also take words and put the words in different order and create much different results. You don't have to just worry about rearranging the letters. You can form words and just use the words as the components. Just rearrange them.
So, the next part is interesting, how where he talks about how death doesn't destroy the seeds, but disunites them. A little bit of conservation of energy.
Actually, it's a conservation of these particle numbers.
Particle numbers.
It doesn't apply to all particles.
Could you say that again, Martin?
I mean, there are different laws of conservation. So there are, for different types of particles, there are laws of conservation as well. And that would be rather the thing, that the seeds do not get destroyed by death.
Conservation of particle number.
Like the number of leptons is preserved. But this has a twist, because if you create one and the antiparticle as well, then the number is also preserved, because antiparticles count negatively. And that just doesn't exist in Epicurus philosophy at that time.
I actually haven't heard of these different laws of conservation.
You've got a Wikipedia article you're looking at?
Mm-hmm.
What's the title of the page?
Conservation law. And I also have a Stack Exchange forum open on physics.
Well, why don't we go on, Charles, unless you have more to say on that?
I think the last sentence is a good sort of illustrating or like final say on how the seeds don't have sensation themselves. I'll repeat it real quick.
Yeah.
So likewise in bodies, when the intervals of the seeds, their courses, connections, weights, strokes, union, motions, order, position, figure, when these are changed, the things themselves must be changed likewise. So if we were to sort of work with the assumption that the seeds themselves have sensation attached to them, this would not be consistent. Position, figure, like how in the first paragraph, when they give out, when there's more weight attached to them, or they wouldn't be able to regenerate after nearly dying or being injured. So if the seeds themselves just sort of had these qualities attached to them, then I don't think they would be that flexible. And it's sort of a odd concept to juggle, but because in the third paragraph, the nature of the seeds with sensation that he's positing, it would be wrong to assume that seeds with sensation would have a difference in their, I guess, foundation. So the seeds that can laugh would not come from the seeds that never smile, and that the wise seeds are produced from foolish seeds and stupid, he says. And then, so likewise in bodies, when the animal's seeds, figures are changed. So with the second to last paragraph, the ending, when these things are changed, the things themselves must be changed likewise. If the seeds themselves had sensation, then they would be completely uniform and inflexible, which would also mean that they cannot regenerate, like stated in the first paragraph. And we also know this because more muscle tissue regenerates and all that and strengthens.
So I guess what you're saying to some degree is that what we do see in the world around us is that we and people and living things do vary over time. Sometimes they're crying, sometimes they're laughing, sometimes they're not doing either one. And so if they were made of a seed of only one kind, they wouldn't have that flexibility to change.
Both emotionally and physiologically.
And so the starting point of the analysis basically is our observation. We know from our daily observation and experience that people are changeable. So therefore we have to account for that.
Yes.
And the method of accounting for it, we could try to come up with a theory in which there's little seeds that are laughing and crying and thinking about themselves and so forth, and that they're all just simultaneously existing within us, and some come to the front when others are when we're happy, and some come to the front when we're sad. And you could try to go in that direction, but there's just really no need to do that whatsoever, because you can explain all of this, all of the variation that we see, just through the rearrangement of the atoms that have no sense whatsoever. They never laugh, they never cry, they never thought processes. They just change their position and arrangement and motion, and what emerges from that change is the things that we see.
Yeah, I was just thinking of his reasoning behind it. I think we sort of hit the mark there.
Yeah, I think you have to, or at least when I think about this thing, I have to kind of start with the result, because when you try to just logically put these pieces together and think about what's possible, you can go in so many different directions. To me, it's easiest just to think about, well, what do I know from my own observation in the world is the result. I know that people do vary in emotions from time to time, and so I have to account for that. And the question, I guess, then becomes, how do you account for it? And you don't have to have little living seeds in order to account for it. Well, if we move on to the final paragraph, I'm interested in trying to go back to what I started with. I mentioned that Martin and I had been discussing the issue of dogmatism. Martin, would you be able to restate what you've observed in the past as a potential pitfall that some people have when they come into contact with Epicurus and his position on what is known as dogmatism?
Yeah, the thing is that dogmatism as a word has a negative connotation. And then people can easily get put off if they get the impression that we have here a dogmatic position on something. But this is just based on, how to say this dogmatism we have. This is essentially based on that we think there are things which are noble, and then if we state that one, then this supports some level of dogmatism.
And of course, at the end of this passage, Epicurus is saying that you've got to question everything. If you think that something is incorrect, you fight it. You question it until you can either accept it and embrace it, or you reject it. This passage starts out, though, there's several things in the passage. He first starts talking about a new question struggling to gain your ear. And then he says, nothing is so easy that no matter how easy it is, it's still more difficult to believe it when you first come into contact with it than after you're familiar with it. I guess that's the point. Nothing is so great or so marvelous that after a time we don't all gradually get used to it and understand it. And he's using the example of just look up at the stars at night. And if you were to look up at those stars for the first time, it would be overwhelmingly brilliant to you. And you'd say, oh my gosh, how could anything be so majestic as the stars and the moon and the sun and those things like that? But that all of us as human beings get used to that. And we don't even bother to look at them anymore after a time because we're so comfortable with the idea that what was so marvelous to us at first is present every day and is really actually a commonplace for us. So he's saying that you can get used to even the strangest idea if you examine it closely enough and begin to understand how it can be. Do you guys agree that that's the direction he's going, or would you put it differently?
No, that's pretty much it. Because looking at Daniel Brown, so surprising would be the sight have been, but now quite tired and cloyed. So that's probably what Lucretius was going for.
Monroe ends that paragraph by saying, cease therefore to be dismayed by the mere novelty, and so to reject reasoning from your mind with loathing. Weigh the questions rather with keen judgment, and if they seem to you to be true, then surrender to them. But if they're false, then gird yourself to the encounter. I think there's probably other examples in the Epicurean text that say the same thing, but this has got to be one of the most clear commands, actually, to just don't take people's word for things. Make sure you understand it yourself and you agree with it yourself. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't agree with it, then fight it as hard as you possibly can. But once you become convinced that something is true, then be convinced that it's true and not just skeptical and think that it could change at any moment. Charles?
I was going to say, we need to come up with or we need to start saving some of these quotes.
If I understand what you're saying there, yeah, I don't know that I have a good list of it, but this passage itself is one that has always stood out for me in Epicurus and Lucretius as being one of the most notable ones, stated poetically and very deep as well in the meaning of it.
Speaking of, we're almost done with book 2, aren't we?
We are just about closing in on the end of book 2. That's correct. I was looking at that before we started. We have basically just one more session, I think, after today, and then we're on to book 3. Exactly.
Yeah. Man, book 2 is rough for me.
Mm-hmm. I think we're going to find that now at the end of book 2, we're largely finished with most of the very basic physics. He comes back to a lot of different aspects of things, but he certainly begins from here on to talk about more everyday issues like the soul and death and the different practical issues that come out as a result of it.
Stallings titles book 3 as Mortality and the Soul.
Yeah, sure. He felt like he needed to lay the foundation for how you reach these other conclusions. Otherwise, his assertions are just assertions. That's something else that's ironic about what Martin was saying a minute ago. People just recoil at the idea that Epicurus was a dogmatic philosopher. But Epicurus spent so much time explaining the reasons why he thought the way he did. He did not just say, believe this and take my word for it. He just explained it in excruciating detail. Go ahead.
There's also the growing trend lately of skepticism, like in terms of epistemology. I've been seeing it more and more and more, like each passing day, it seems.
Well, of course, it seems to have been a big issue in Epicurus' time as well. So, and I guess you could extend it over maybe into nihilism, and that is one of the maybe I shouldn't say eternal maybe, but it is certainly an ongoing problem. And since you're not God, since you don't have omnipotence or omniscience, and I remember this DeWitt just talks about this several times, I think, too, in his book about you're not going to ever be omniscient. You're not going to ever know everything you'd like to know. So you've got to come to terms with what are you satisfied with and what does it mean to be satisfied? What does it mean to be confident? What does it mean to say that you know something? Because you're not omnipotent, you're not omniscient, you're not all-knowing. You're never going to be that. Does that mean because you're not all-knowing that you cannot know anything? And I guess that's your issue of skepticism. Do you immediately fall down from realizing that you're not omniscient do you immediately fall down into absolute skepticism, or are there intermediate positions that make sense? I'm not even sure it's accurate to call Epicurus an intermediate position. I think that'd probably be wrong too, but he's certainly a different position. Epicurus does not believe in omniscience, nor does he believe in radical skepticism. He takes another position that some things are knowable and some things are not, based on his definitions of all the words that are involved in that. I think that's where he goes, where is a good description of it.
Yeah, I've never thought about the connection between nihilism and epistemology. I guess there wouldn't be any positive value attached to knowledge in that case, which would translate into things being known, or that there's a degree of certainty to the knowledge. But,
yeah, I don't think they're the same thing, but they can be similar, I guess, for the reason you just said.
It would have some overlap with skepticism.
I guess you could be a nihilist and think that nothing matters without being a skeptic. But if you're a skeptic, it seems to me it'd be pretty hard not to be a nihilist.
I think because of the growing trend of a lot of skeptics, it enters a very spiritual gateway. Like there's like a degree of humbleness or fallibility attached to us being humans or individuals upon knowing things with certainty, which again relates to the sort of general negative connotation from dogmatism or anything considered dogmatic. There was a person in one of my Discord servers, at the time, they considered themselves, they were partially Buddhist and partially Puritanist, and they took on a very, very staunch epistemic skeptic position on everything, that knowledge could even be known in the first place, like a radical skeptic.
Yeah.
And it tied into his spirituality.
Charles, you said partially Buddhist and partially what? Puritanist? Did you say?
Puritanist, yes.
Puritanist, of course.
And it's sort of a growing trend, not Buddhism or Puritanism, but just like skeptic epistemology.
Charles, you're calling it a growing trend. I'm not sure it's not the majority view.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that? Do you think it's the majority or minority or what?
Definitely not majority, but I've been seeing it more and more on philosophy boards, forums, subreddits, stuff like that are recent, as in like within the past like 3 years.
Well, I think in a recent podcast, Martin clarified that one way of looking at certainty is a p-value of 0.005. What'd you say about that?
I mean, it's basically using a statistical test and then using a parameter from the statistical test to, depending on the context, you set a certain level, and then if the test then supports a hypothesis, then you take this as proven, basically.
Well, we'll have one more session next week on Book 2 before we move to Book 3. Anything else on today's material?
No, I can't think of anything to add.
Okay, well, that might be a reasonable place to bring it to an end for today. Martin, anything else from you?
No.
Okay, we'll close for the day then. Thanks a lot, guys. Talk to you next week.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Okay.